Good morning. My name is Cherish Jones, and it's my privilege to serve as your worship associate today. Playing Journey this morning was fantastic, but I'm used to karaokeing to it, so it was hard. I almost came up and did a full karaoke for you. We come together in community, supporting and encouraging each other in our spiritual journeys, affirming the importance not only of tolerance, but of acceptance, compassion, and open-mindedness. Welcome to this good place, Tapestry, a Unitarian Universalist congregation. Today we complete our month on our topic of compassion. Becoming a mom certainly makes you compassionate as regards to children, but I often forget about compassion for myself. I am always wondering if I've done things the best way and judging myself for everything I do with my kids. This may not be right, but I know that I'm not the only mom that does this either. I remember when I was 9.5 months pregnant with my second child. I was waddling through JCPenney's when Ainsley, my then almost 2-year-old, decided to throw a monstrous tantrum in the middle of the store. I was a bit of a loss. Of course I wanted to leave, quickly, but she seemed to have kicking and screaming as her priority and refused to let me pick her up. Remember, I was very pregnant, and so bending over was quite a task. I felt embarrassed, helpless, and I tried to think of every possible thing to do. It felt like every other person's eyes were on me, on us, judging me for how I was or was not acting. And hiding in a rack of clothes was not an option. And that's when an elderly man came along, a total stranger. And to be honest, someone I thought was going to come and lecture me in the ways of disciplining my kid. But he did not. Instead, he immediately bent down to Ainsley's level and very happily asked her a question. She was so shocked by this strange, cheerful man that she stopped crying and instantly jumped into my arms for protection. At that point, all she wanted was mommy and to leave with me very quickly. He smiled at me. That always works, he said, chuckling. And then he followed with a gentle pat on my arm. You're doing a good job, Mom, he said. I think we all need to remember to be compassionate to ourselves. Give ourselves a pat on the back once in a while. We're doing a good job. Our minister, the Reverend Kent Doss, is not in the pulpit today. Today we have the privilege of welcoming Sarah England as our guest speaker. Miss England is the Associate Professor of Anthropology at Soka University. She teaches courses on gender and sexuality, race and ethnicity, Latin American immigration, and violence and inequality in Central America. She will be discussing the question of whether asylum law displays compassion. If you're a Facebook user, please be sure to check in and tell your friends what a wonderful congregation we are. Now, would you please take a moment to turn off your cell phones or other devices that may be disruptive during our worship time together. Also, to maintain a contemplative atmosphere, please hold your applause until after the postlude is finished and the service is completed. We are a welcoming congregation, and we extend a warm greeting to any newcomers. We invite those who are visiting for the first or second time, if you're comfortable doing so, to please stand and introduce yourselves so we may have the opportunity to get to know you. now Caitlin Riva will present our Time for All Ages. I invite children and the young of heart to come forward and sit on the carpet.
I was sliding down so fast.
Morning, Piper.
I was sliding down so fast on a big, huge slide.
You hurt your arm?
And guess what? I got a
bruise.
A burn under this Band-Aid. It doesn't that sound bad?
Good morning. So today, when we go to our classes, the speaker's going to talk about something called asylum. There are people who have to leave their homes and their countries because it's too dangerous, it's too violent, so they can't stay there. So this is a story about a boy named Hassan, okay, who has to do that. It's called The Color of Home, okay?
Well, I used to live in Minneapolis.
This is a little different, yeah.
And then we moved all
Yeah, you'll see when he moves, he doesn't take anything with him. When you moved from Minneapolis, did you bring stuff?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. We have a new boy joining us in school today, said Miss Kelly. His name is Hassan, and he's from Somalia. I want you to make him feel at home. But the classroom didn't feel like home to Hassan at all. In his real home, he had lessons outside from early in the morning until the sun grew too hot at midday. Here, he had to stay indoors except at recess, when he shivered outside on the damp playground. The children were friendly. They smiled at Hassan, and one of the boys kicked a soccer ball toward him. But he didn't understand anything that anyone said, only his name and hello and bathroom. It was tiring remembering even a few English words. After lunch, which Hassan didn't eat because he didn't know what it is, Miss Kelly gave all the children big sheets of paper and pinned them to easels. She gave Hassan paintbrushes and a jar of water and showed him where all the colors were. He understood from her smiles and her movements that she wanted him to paint a picture, but he had never done such a thing before. He watched the other children for a while, then chose a bottle of bright blue. He painted a blue, blue sky without any clouds. Then a white house, a yellow sun, and mimosa trees. Outside the house, he made stick figures, himself, his father, his mother holding a bundle that was his baby sister, Naima, his grandparents, his uncle, and his 2 cousins. There were 9 people outside the house, all who lived inside it. Then Hassan took more paint and put in the animals, a flock of white sheep, some brown goats, and a small sandy creature that was supposed to be his cat. What a lovely picture, Hassan, said Miss Kelly. What beautiful, bright colors. But Hassan hadn't finished. Now he chose red and orange and painted big flames on the roof of the house. The blue sky changed to a murky purple. He took the red paint again and splattered it on the white walls of the house. He smudged his uncle out of the picture. Oh, Hassan, said Miss Kelly, it's all spoiled. What a shame. Hassan didn't know what her words meant, but he heard the sadness in her voice and knew that she understood his picture. What did you do at school today? His mother asked when she picked him up. Painting, said Hassan. Can I see? She said. All around them, other children were showing their pictures to their parents. No, said Hassan, the paint is still wet. He didn't want his mother to be sad. You can see it tomorrow. The next day, Hassan wanted to tell Miss Kelly that he must make a new picture, but she had someone with her, a Somali lady wearing a black hijab like his mother, but she also wore blue jeans and a black leather jacket like a Western woman. Hello, Hassan, said the woman. Then she began to speak to him in Somali. I'm Fella. I've come to translate for you and help you with your English. Miss Kelly thought you might want to tell us about your picture. So another teacher taught the rest of the class math, while Hassan sat in the reading corner with Fella and Miss Kelly and his picture. That's my house in Somalia, he said, looking at Fella, who put his words into English. That's my family, and that's my cat Musa, who we had to leave behind. And who's this? Asked Miss Kelly, pointing to the smudge near the red splashes. That's my Uncle Ahmed, said Hassan, and then he told them the whole story about the noise, the flames, and the smell of burning. When the soldiers came, I hid in my cousin's room, he said. I didn't find out what happened to my uncle until later. My father came and got me out from under the bed and said we were leaving. We all left right away except my uncle. We had no luggage, only my father's prayer mat and Quran hidden in Naima's diaper bag. I wanted to take Musa, my cat, but my mother said we must save ourselves and not the animals. I cried then, not for my uncle, but for my cat, Musa. We went on a big ship from Mogadishu to Mombasa. Then we lived in a camp for a long time. Naima learned to walk there. It was cold at night, and my mother had to wait in line for all our food. People stole things, and all my mother's gold jewelry disappeared. But I think that was because we bought tickets to America. My cousins and grandparents stayed behind. I was frightened when I saw the plane we were going to fly in because I thought it might have bombs in it. The journey was so long, but I wasn't happy when it was over. Our new country seemed all cold and gray, and the apartment we live in is gray too, with brown furniture. We seem to have left all the colors behind in Somalia. Hassan talked for an hour and then ran out of words, even in Somali. When he finished, Miss Kelly had tears in her eyes. "Tell her I want to make another picture," Hassan said to Fella, "for my mother." Then he played soccer with the friendly boy who pointed to himself and said, "Jake." That afternoon, Hassan painted a new picture. It had blue sky, the White House, and the yellow sun. But this time, there was no people, just sheep and goats and Musa the cat with his long, spindly legs. There were no flames or bullets. By the end of the school day, the picture was dry. "It's beautiful," said Hassan's mother. "It's our home in Somalia," said Hassan. "I know," said his mother. "We'll put it on the wall of our home here in America." "Let me push Naima," said Hassan, and he walked home, pushing his little sister in her stroller. At home, they showed the picture to his father, who stuck it on the wall. The blue, yellow, and white looked bright against the gray paint. Next to it hung the maroon prayer mat that had come with them on their travels. And as Hassan looked around the room, he saw other colors, things his mother had made, a green cushion, an orange tablecloth, and a pink dress she was sewing for Naima. Just then, the sun came out, and there was blue sky outside their window. Hassan looked at his family and said, "Daddy, can we have a new cat?" And he said cat in English. It was one of the new words he had learned today. Tomorrow, he would ask Miss Kelly to tell him the word for home. So that is the story of Hassan and his family. All right, so I'll let you guys bring the book to your classroom in case you want to have questions about it, okay? All right, thank you. We're going to go to our classes.
And I brought
Today's reading is a poem written by Shani Chief Tecumseh. So live your life that the fear of death can never enter your heart. Trouble no one about their religion. Respect others in their view and demand that they respect yours. Love your life, perfect your life, beautify all things in your life. Seek to make your life long and its purpose in the service of your people. Prepare a noble death song for the day when you go over the great divide. Always give a word or a sign of salute when meeting or passing a friend, even a stranger when in a lonely place. Show respect to all people and grovel to none. When you arise in the morning, give thanks for the food and for the joy of living. If you see no reason for giving thanks, the fault lies only in yourself. Abuse no one and no thing, for abuse turns the wise ones to fools and robs the spirit of its vision.
So I have a prediction. There's going to be a new Wikipedia entry. It's going to be, the term's going to be sore loser. We're just going to see a picture of Supreme Court Justice Scalia. So I was going to do a song that I wrote, but with the events happening recently, it just seemed like not the day for it. Because everyone knows it's been a wild time between South Carolina and now the decision Friday. It's really been one is a reminder of racism being alive and well, and the other being a reminder, as the sign said before, that love wins. So it's a Confederate flags going down, rainbow flags going up. So I thought about 5 years ago, I was at a service when Reverend Tom was here, and I did this old spiritual, and I think he was talking about marriage equality at the time when no one knew what was really going to be happening, and now here it is. So this is a good time to revisit this, and so I hope everybody sings, and it's there's still grieving for South Carolina. There's celebration for Friday. There's recognition of the work to be done against racism, and as we're going to hear about asylum issues. So this is the one-size-fits-all spiritual for grieving, celebrating. shall not be moved. We shall not be moved like a tree standing by the water. We shall not be moved. Working for social justice, we shall not be moved. Working for social justice, we shall not be moved like a tree standing by the water. We shall not be moved. Flying flags of freedom, we shall not be moved. Flying flags of freedom, we shall not be moved like a tree standing by the water. We shall not be moved. Standing on the side of love, we shall not be moved. Standing on the side of love, we shall not be moved like a tree standing by the water. We shall not be moved. We shall not be moved. We shall not be moved like a tree standing by the waters. We shall not be moved.
So good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak here today. I'm familiar with this congregation through the detainee visitation program, which I was participating in for a while. I got kind of busy. I was recently made the Associate Dean of Students at SoCo, which is an incredibly busy position. I hope to get back to being able to visit soon. I just wanted to say that though through my familiarity with the Unitarian Church in general and this particular congregation, I'm constantly impressed by your work and your dedication to social justice, which is something that I'm also very passionate about. So I'm really glad to be able to share with you some of the things that I have learned through my research on gender violence in Central America. That's the primary research that I'm doing right now. And my experience as an expert witness in asylum cases of women from Guatemala who are fleeing that gender violence. And my thoughts on how that connects to your monthly theme of compassion. Okay, go to the next slide. Okay, sorry. I hadn't actually seen these slides yet, so I didn't know how they were going to come out. So I want to begin by thinking about the definition of compassion. And so probably you've talked about this extensively already this month, but this is a definition that I found online. So it's a response to the suffering of others that motivates a desire to help. But I also found this quote from Nelson Mandela: "Our human compassion binds us the one to the other, not in pity or patronizingly, but as human beings who have learned how to turn our common suffering into hope for the future." And I think this is a really important quote because it speaks to the importance of compassion, but also points to some of the problems with the way we sometimes enact compassion. In other words, while compassion is obviously a good thing and it motivates us to help others, my question is, what happens when that motivation comes from pity or a patronizing sense of superiority? And here I don't mean necessarily a sense of superiority over the individual who's suffering, but what I mean is a sense of coming from a culturally or superior society. In other words, being motivated to help or feeling one is in a position to help because one comes from a society that one considers to be superior to that of the person who is suffering. And as I'm going to show you, I think asylum law sort of does this. Does that really display compassion, and does it really address social injustice that causes the person suffering in the first place, right? So I'm going to try to answer that question today by using the example of asylum law, which is ostensibly based on a humanitarian desire to give refuge to those who are suffering in their own country, but that, as I will show, has some problematic aspects to it that prevent it from displaying compassion as Mandela is defining it. So I'll go over the way that asylum law is framed, the criteria that an asylee must meet, and get us to think about what kinds of compassion is being displayed when we have a law that forces agents of the system, so the asylum officers, the judges, the lawyers, the people who work with asylees, to discriminate between different kinds of victims and different kinds of suffering in order to determine who gets help and who does not and why. Right? So, yeah. Okay, good, that worked out. Okay, so I just want to go over a little bit of the history of asylum law, just to kind of give you a sense of where it comes from, both internationally and in the United States. So the Article 14 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights recognizes the right of persons to seek asylum from persecution. So in 1951, the United Nations created the Convention relating to the status of refugees in order to create a standard international definition of a refugee, and it also has with it a list of rights that refugees should have wherever they are in the world. So as you can see, this is the definition that was written in 1951. In 1951. And if you read it, you'll see that the way asylum is, or the way a refugee is defined, is really related to what was going on in 1951 in Europe. In other words, this was written for the people who were displaced by World War II in Europe in terms of the persecution having to occur before 1951, and also the protected categories that are listed. So people being persecuted based on race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion, right? And this is still the definition that is basically used today, both internationally and also, as we'll see, in U.S. asylum law. And except that in 1967 they removed the timeline. So of course now it applies to anybody who's suffered any kind of persecution at any time. So obviously since 1951 there's been many, many situations that created whole new sets of refugees, right? And just to clarify the difference between refugee and asylee, if you don't know, this can be kind of confusing. A refugee and an asylee are both defined by this definition. This is the criteria that has to be met. The only difference is where they're applying. So a refugee is somebody who applies to be able to enter a country to be to get asylum in that country, but they're applying from outside of that country. So if someone wants to be in the United States and they're applying from outside of that country, they're a refugee before they get here. An asylee is somebody who gets to the United States somehow through a tourist visa, or they cross the border undocumented, however they manage to get in, and are applying for asylum from within the country. But the definition is the same. The criteria that have to be met is the same. So U.S. policy towards refugees up until 1980 was very ad hoc, right? So before 1980, before we had the Refugee Act, basically asylum and refugee these were policies that were designed for particular countries, very particular circumstances, and it mainly defined persecution in a political sense. In fact, many people still use the term political asylum. They don't just say asylum. And it was really designed for those fleeing communist regimes or Middle Eastern countries. So it was for Eastern Europe, Korea, Vietnam, China, and Cuba. So we can see that it was really based on U.S. foreign policy during the Cold War era, right? That was really what it was about. So in 1980, the Refugee Act was passed, and the idea was to incorporate the UN definition of refugee, to have a more standardized definition that was in accordance with international definition, and also to be more generic, so to not really focus on a particular country, but just anybody who could meet the criteria of being, a refugee or an asylee. It didn't matter what country they came from, and not necessarily political. So in 1990s was when you first start seeing the first cases of women who are applying for asylum in the United States based on what we call gender violence. So gender violence is any violence that occurs that is motivated by the particular society's ideas about gender and sexuality. So this tends to be mainly directed towards women, though it can also be directed towards transgender people, LGBTQ children and so on, right? Okay, sorry, next slide. So what does an asylee have to demonstrate, right? So if you're in the United States and you're applying for asylum, what do you have to prove to the immigration judge in order to be given asylum? And so this is the current definition of a refugee or asylee in the United States. As you can see, it's pretty identical to the UN definition, again, with the exception of the timeline. So the first thing that the asylee has to prove is that they have a credible fear of persecution if they return to their country. So this could be based on the fact that they've already been persecuted, or that the situation in the country is such that they are likely to be persecuted. In other words, they belong to a group that's their other members of that group have been persecuted, and so it's likely that it will happen to them, or they've been threatened, right? And that the situation has not changed since they left. Sometimes people leave their countries and seek asylum much later. They have to prove that nothing has changed, right? The danger is still there. The definition of persecution, sorry, can you go to the next slide? Yeah, okay, so persecution, this is how persecution is defined: to harass, punish, injure, oppress, or otherwise cause someone to suffer physical or psychological harm. So you can see that it's really quite broad, and that, things that we call gender violence, honor killings, female circumcision, sexual assault, domestic violence, these would all definitely fall within this definition of persecution. And so just to give you a sense of the kinds of cases that I have worked on and that are pretty representative of the things you see women who are coming from Central America, throughout Central America and also Mexico, are facing. So the first case that I was asked to work on was a woman who is an indigenous woman from Totonicapan, the highlands of Guatemala. She went to work in Guatemala City when she was 16 as a domestic, and she was raped by several different employers. The last one threatened to kill her if she reported any of this to the police, and so she decided to leave the country. Another case was a girl who was left by her parents. They both migrated to the United States. She was left with relatives when she was 9 years old. She was a victim of incest by those relatives, uncle and cousins. And then she eventually formed an intimate relationship with a gang member who carried out domestic abuse to her and also threatened to kill her if she tried to escape. So her one escape was trying to get to the United States, which she did with her parents. And another case was a woman who was robada, and this is a very interesting practice that exists. It sort of falls between eloping and being kidnapped. So it's a way that sometimes a couple, if the parents don't agree for them to be married, they can run off together, and then the idea is that, well, if they've had intimate relations, now the girl's honor has been besmirched, she's ruined, so she just as well marry the guy, right? But then on the other end, it can also be used as an act of violence by a man who wants a particular woman. He literally kidnaps her, rapes her, and now, by the same logic, she is his, right? And so in this particular case, the girl had been kidnapped, she was locked in her in-laws' house, repeatedly raped, and beaten to the point that she had a miscarriage, and at that point she escaped to the United States. So these are the kinds of abuse, of persecution that some women are facing. They're very extreme. They are very much tied in many ways to cultural ideologies, as you can see, about gender and sexuality and women's bodies and men's ownership of those bodies and so on. And sometimes they're linked to gang activity and drug trafficking and other things that are going on. So in these cases and many others, you can see that what's interesting, so that by the time they get to an immigration judge, that means that the women have been found to be credible. In other words, the asylum officer or the immigration judge believes their story. They're not denying that the persecution occurred. There's no denial of that. You say, yes, we recognize you faced this horrible thing. A lot of times they are also interviewed by a psychologist or a psychiatrist who can see that they've been traumatized. So that's not really the problem. The problem lies not in deciding whether the woman is a victim or not, but whether she's the right kind of victim. In other words, does her persecution fit other legal criteria for asylum? So another thing that has to be proven is that the government is unwilling or unable to protect her. Now, in the case of Central America and Mexico, this is actually very easy to prove. The government, even though it has recently, at least in Guatemala, passed some very good laws, they're on the books, they've tried to create these special units that investigate these crimes and so on. The impunity rates are still 98%. That means that only 2% of cases actually go to trial. So if you persecute someone in this way in Guatemala, you have a 98% chance that you're going to get away with it. And so the woman is very, very unprotected. They have things, something like a restraining order. They're very ineffective and so on. So this is actually really easy to prove. There's lots of human rights reports, Amnesty International, even the U.S. State Department backs this up, that this is the situation. So where the problem lies, where a lot of these cases don't get accepted and these women are denied asylum, is around the issue of nexus. So one of the things that the lawyer has to prove is not only that they were persecuted, not only that the government won't help them, but they were persecuted on account of the victim belonging to one of the 5 protected categories: race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or particular social group. So as you can see, gender or sex is not on the list, so the lawyers have to argue that they belong to a particular social group. A particular social group has to be immutable. In other words, it has to be identified by a characteristic that the person either cannot change, or it is so fundamental to them that they shouldn't have to change it. And it has to be socially visible. In other words, society recognizes it as a group. Right? So obviously being a woman fits this criteria, but judges don't want to use this as a category because they see it as too broad. There's this fear of opening the floodgates, every Central American woman will want to come here and so on. So what they often have to do is define it in these very bizarre ways. Like she belongs to the category of women who used to be married to military officers, or women who resisted the abuse of their husbands, and that's imputed to be a political opinion. Or they do these weird, acrobatics with the terms in order to create these categories. So the thing is, even if the judge accepts this as a particular social group, you still have to prove that the persecution is linked to the fact that she belongs to that particular social group. And this is where really the problems arise. And this is because a lot of asylum officers and judges do not see domestic violence as a systemic public matter, but rather a private matter of bad luck. In other words, it's not the fault of the state or society, but just a personal problem, and therefore not the right kind of persecution to apply for asylum. And by the way, a lot of these unaccompanied minors that are coming from Central America and are applying for asylum based on fleeing gang violence, this is exactly the reason they're not being given asylum either. They're not seen as a particular social group, and their type of persecution is seen as too broad, too general. It's just, sorry, you just live in a crime-ridden area, right? So it's a similar kind of problem. So the problem then is that the way asylum is framed is that it's still stuck in this old model that persecution only counts for the purposes of asylum if it is carried out systematically as government policy or some particular group based on political motives. But obviously domestic violence is not politically motivated generally. It is not government policy. It is enacted by individuals. It is usually carried out in private. Often there's no witnesses. And so it just seems so many judges and asylum officers just see this as a matter of having married the wrong guy who happens to be violent, rather than something that rises to the level of what would be called systemic persecution, right? Which is what you have to show in order to get asylum. But as feminist academics and activists have been saying for a long time, the personal is political, right? We've been hearing that from the 70s, I guess. And gender-based violence is not random, but has clear patterns that are motivated by cultural ideas about gender and sexuality that not only motivate the abuse, but also make it so that many women get no support from their families or communities if they resist. Again, based on this idea of shame, right? That it's a shame to even admit that this is happening to you and so on. The state does not protect them due to the way that laws are written and implemented, and victims are not able to assert their rights due to other forms of gender inequality, right? Poverty, and so on, right? So clearly this should be considered a systemic form of persecution, but unfortunately some of the agents of the asylum process don't recognize it as such. So my job as an expert witness, what I have to do then is I write a country conditions report that essentially makes these arguments, right? That the asylee's claim of persecution is credible, this is something that happens often, there's a cultural logic to it, it's not random, the state is unwilling or unable to protect her, and that it's not just her own personal problem, but this is a larger systemic problem, that therefore it should really be considered persecution by the legal definition that asylum requires, right? And so I gladly do this because I believe this to be true, but I also, of course, want to help in these asylum cases. I want the women to be able to get asylum. But I also find there's some problems with this. And the main problem that I have is that it is based on framing the victim's suffering in a very specific way. The lawyers, myself as an expert witness, even the victim herself has to frame her suffering in this very specific way in order to meet the criteria of asylum. So for me, I have to show that it is the fault of Guatemalan culture and society. I have to say Guatemalan society is very machista and the government is inefficient. And of course, this feeds into so many stereotypes that we have about the third world, right? And by implication, it suggests that the U.S. is a haven against these types of abuse, right? So I have to say, oh, it's so terrible in Guatemala, but oh, here she'll be safe because, somehow the U.S., we've transcended this, which of course is not true. We know that violence against women, gender violence, is also very rampant in the United States. It also follows a particular cultural logic, and the criminal justice system is not always that great at dealing with it, right? So it's not just something that those people over there suffer, but we also suffer here. So by making these arguments to the judge, I'm asking the system to be compassionate and grant her refuge, but I have to do it in this patronizing way that demonizes her culture and society while simultaneously making it seem that mine is superior. And for me, I find this very problematic, especially as an anthropologist, right? This goes against everything that anthropologists believe in, right? Another problem is that writing the claim to asylum in this way makes it seem as though the U.S. offers asylum only as a humanitarian favor, rather than recognizing that in some sense the U.S. has the responsibility to help these people because the poverty, the levels of violence in general, and the failure of the state, which makes these women vulnerable to such forms of abuse, has been exacerbated by U.S. foreign and economic policy. In other words, we don't live in a bubble. We don't live in, this is our bubble and that's their bubble. And their bubble, they have their things going on and their problems, and here's our bubble over here. Oh, thank you. But rather, our lives are very interconnected. Her suffering and the reasons why she is suffering and reason why the state won't protect her are in many ways connected to my life here in the United States and the way that our government has acted in Central America historically and currently. And so I find it very problematic for me not to be able to talk about that. I have to just talk about how it's so horrible in Guatemala and blame them. And I think this is part of the debate, for example, that's going on right now in Europe with what to do with all the refugees that are arriving to the shores of Europe right now. Is it their responsibility to take care of these people? Are they just doing it because they're in a position to and they're privileged? What is going on? And I think people are actually having that discussion, whereas I don't really think that discussion is happening in the United States. We just see it as a favor. Well, it's not really our problem, but we'll help you out, right? And again, I find that kind of patronizing. So in conclusion, I feel that asylum policy, as it operates right now, at least in the United States, and from what I've seen of it, does not seem to be overall motivated by compassion, again, in the way that Nelson Mandela defined it. Because it's a very hard filter to get through based on legalistic definitions of the right kind of persecution and the right kinds of victims, where not all suffering counts. So many of these asylum cases are denied. The Central American children, a lot of them are denied. The ones fleeing gang violence are denied. A lot of these women don't get asylum. And so obviously that's going to perpetuate their suffering and the suffering of their families who are left behind, because if they don't get asylum, then they can't apply for their family members to come. And when asylum is granted, it displays a form of compassion that's based on a patronizing attitude towards the home country of the asylee, not on a sense of our common vulnerability to persecution. This is something that could happen to anyone, anywhere. We're not living in a society that is perfect. And we also need, I think what the asylum process does is it keeps us from thinking about the flaws in our own society, right? And we're only focusing on the flaws in these other societies. And then finally, I also feel that it prevents us from thinking about our responsibility to people as fellow humans whose futures and pasts are connected. Again, we want to say, oh, that's their problem over there. It's not really my problem. I'm just doing you a favor by letting you in, rather than really thinking about how your problem is connected to my society and what my society has done. So in the end, it may help some individuals who make it through the legal filter to find refuge, but it doesn't really lead people in this country or those who participate in the system to really question global systems of inequality and all of our place within it, right? Not just the victims. So I think we have to ask ourselves why we have such a restrictive asylum policy that only recognizes certain kinds of suffering, and what would a truly compassionate policy look like? Thank you.
We extinguish this flame, knowing that the light remains in the warmth and compassion of our hearts until we are together again. On Thursday, July 2nd, at 7 p.m., we'll be holding a volunteer orientation for the Friends of Orange County Detainees. So if you'd like more information on this, please see Bev Huff in the back. She has lots of information. Our closing words are by Philip Randall Giles. Now may our wisdom show itself in compassion and understanding, and may the fruits of the Spirit be apparent in our lives. Namaste and blessed be.